Hi, we continue today in 1 Samuel 22 with the dramatic confrontation between Saul and Ahimelech, and along with him, all the priests that were at Nob, the ones of his father's house, and all of them who came to the king. On the right side of the screen, you can see the two chiasms that interlock here that I tried to explain last time, express a complex relationship between what's going on here beyond just the linear reading of the story. And I'd like to suggest that again here because the center of each chiasm is close to where we are in our scene from 11 to 15 today, 16 today. So in the chiasm from Pockelman, we see that the verse 14 and 15 of Ahimelech's defense is right there in between the accusation and Saul's judgment. But on the one that I'm suggesting is nested within this, and it doesn't fit exactly within it, so the centers are not the same. You can see the center here is in verse 10, and the center here is a few verses down. It's still around the center of a question of Ahimelech, but the issue is of whether he inquired of Yahweh or not. And that becomes a key point here, because among the various ways that Ahimelech defends himself, he'll mostly talk about Saul's relationship with David, and after having done that, suggest that why, of course, would I not have inquired of Yahweh? Which highlights that the relationship is one about relationship with Yahweh. That it's not just a matter of Ahimelech and David or Ahimelech and Saul, but at the center of all this is the claim of whose side is Yahweh on. And since Ahimelech understands that Yahweh is on David's side, he's on David's side too and doesn't understand why Saul would not be on David's side, as we'll see. So we'll be looking at those two together, and we're also going to be looking at the key words in our section here, which I looked at last time, but highlighting that for Saul, all he can refer to Ahimelech, except on the end, is as son of Ahitub, and the narrator in turn simply refers to Saul as the king, not referring to him as Saul as such. So they're in their roles here, although the role of Ahimelech is not so much as priest as we saw in the previous scene with David and Ahimelech, but here when the slaughter in the next scene we'll look at, it's all about the priest, and we'll see that framing here. So let's just jump right into our scene here. Having been reported by Doeg, the king sent for the priest Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, and for all his father's house. And already we have a problem, because if we go back up, we see that back in verse 6, Saul had heard that David was in a new location, but then he complains that none of his slaves tell him what his son is doing or what the son of Jesse is doing, and he charges them all with conspiring against him. But who then did he send for the priest Ahimelech here? Certainly it has to be one of those slaves, because it suggests that all his slaves are surrounding him. So even though he's just railed against them as conspirators, he sends for the priest Ahimelech through them. And I was highlighting at the end of the video last time the map, that even though we don't know exactly where Nob is, it's probably in this close location somewhere between Jerusalem and Gibeah, which is to say he had to send a message back there while Doeg is still with him, and then have all these priests come. And we don't know how many of them there are yet, but we're going to find out in the next scene. There are 85 who were killed and one who escaped. And we're also told that it's a city of priests, although that will come as a surprise to us. But it's a huge number, and I invited us to consider in the end of the last video what it would be like to be in Nob, having had Ahimelech meet with David with Doeg there, and now some short time later have a message from King Saul in Gibeah to come for a meeting with the king. They certainly must understand that they're going to be charged with disloyalty and siding with David, and they could certainly anticipate that they might get killed for that, and yet they go. Why don't they run away? David's been running from Saul for a couple of chapters, and he's going to keep running away from him really through the end of 1 Samuel until Saul's dead. And so these priests could have either run away, or they could have joined David's band of now 400 people and just melted into that, and at least taken their chances with David. So why did they just turn themselves into Saul with the likelihood that they might get killed? And to answer that, we have to look at Ahimelech's testimony to at least try to get some possibility of what's going on here. So he sent for them, and notice how the narrator highlights in an almost chiastic way this triple repetition of who's coming. All his father's house, the priests who were at Nob, and all of them came to the king, highlighting the all, that there were none left there. And as my note below suggests, revealing the lie about no bread. With so many mouths to feed, there had to be a full provision available for David. So that when Ahimelech told him, we have no hot bread, there's only the showbread, the holy bread, that plainly was a coded lie, as I indicated last time. But now is when we find that out for sure, that there are all these other priests who need to be fed. And so they all come, and Saul begins to speak, and he speaks pejoratively right away. And we can notice in this initial exchange in verse 12 the difference in tone for both of them. So Saul says, listen, now, or listen please, really, Shema na, the Shema, like the Shema in Deuteronomy, so a command of Yahweh, but coming from the mouth of the king, to listen to the king, not to listen to Yahweh, which that the audience would certainly understand that Shema implies listen to your Lord your God. But listen now, son of Ahitub, and I was saying last time, like son of Jesse, this is a pejorative way to refer to him not by his proper name, but by his ancestry, dissing him from the start. But he answers politely and respectfully, "Here I am, my Lord," echoing Samuel responding to Eli back in chapter 3. And certainly we should be expected to hear that. And we know that Yahweh was with Samuel and had left Eli at that point, which Eli acknowledges, although Saul will not acknowledge that Yahweh is not with him here. And he refers to him as my Lord, Adonai, here. So in the same way that Saul is pejoratively referring to Ahimelech by his father's name, Ahimelech refers to Saul by a respectful name. And then he issues this charge. And so let's see the whole charge in one verse here. Saul said to him, "Why have you conspired against me?" Now, we have no reason to think he has conspired against him, although at least to know that Saul has conspired against him, unless we think of that conversation that Doeg overheard as that conspiracy. And that may well be what Saul is referring to, since Doeg reported in the last scene. "You and the son of Jesse," again with the pejorative place. Notice he's dropped out his own son, which, as I was noting when we looked at the key words here, the issue of my son was the charge here when he was talking to his own slaves, but now he drops out the charge against Jonathan, and it's just the son of Jesse, by giving him bread and a sword, highlighting that Saul has missed the point through Doeg's telling of it. Although Doeg did not say it was bread, Doeg said generically it was provisions. He interprets that as bread, although bread can also mean generically food. But either way, he misses that it was holy bread. And he doesn't note that it was the sword of Goliath. So Saul, in his paranoid ranting here and lack of rationality, is missing the very cues that would give him the evidence he needs to convict him of conspiracy. But he doesn't draw upon the evidence that's presented to him. And then he adds, by inquiring of God for him. Notice again, not of Yahweh, but of God, so that he has risen against me to lie in wait as he is doing today. So Saul is suggesting the cause and effect, that it's because of Ahimelech's conspiring against him and giving him bread and a sword and acquiring that he has risen against me, which might well suggest, if that was true, that the inquiring of God would lead David to rise against him following God's will. But of course, that's not what's happening. David is not rising against him. He's trying to escape and stay alive. And if anything, it's Saul who will be lying in wait for David, as we'll see later. So this is not true, but what can Ahimelech say to that? And this is what we hear him say. And it's a surprisingly wonderful, I think, response here that we hear from this. And I want to bring Reese's point that I have brought up a couple of times in this interaction between David and Saul and Ahimelech, especially the last one, where she, I think, had the best interpretation we've seen. And she notes that the usual interpretation that has Ahimelech deceived by David and leaves one wondering why he doesn't confess here to save his life. She argues, "You know that Ahimelech cannot claim he was deceived, but in truth he was a party to the deceit." And certainly that's the case. And she goes on and says, "Heroically maintaining a posture of precise honesty, the priest makes the only defense he can." And I'd like to run with that as well, but only after we listen to his defense, and then we'll come back to that. So he answers the king, "Who among all your servants is as faithful as David," or literally as supportive and loyal? And he asks that as a rhetorical question. Saul has already said the rest of his slaves are not disclosing to him and are conspiring against him, so it's a low bar here. But he's suggesting that David is as faithful as anybody. He is, after all, the king's son-in-law, and as my note below suggests, that would be an unpleasant reminder for Saul that not only was his son Jonathan cutting a covenant with David, the son of Jesse, but his daughter Michal did as well, married to him, of course, and he doesn't need a separate covenant, they have a marriage covenant, but by hiding him, letting him escape and pretending he was there in bed and fooling Saul's servant there. So an unpleasant reminder that both his children that we know of are on David's side. And then quick to do your bidding, which is a really bad translation here, because literally, as Fackelman notes, commander of your picked men based on Mishmaath, a detachment which obeys the king. Or as the Net Bible suggests, the leader of your bodyguard, who makes him either parallel to or a rival to Doeg. which is to say now we can look back and see with David on the run, Doeg has apparently been appointed to take David's place as the head person in this household. And so no wonder Doeg wants to out David to Saul. He sees David as his primary personal rival. So Doeg, like so many characters we'll see in the fall of the house of David in 2 Samuel, is there ostensibly serving the king, but also, as people do in political situations like this, making sure that his own position is secured. And finally, he argues, and honored or literally glorified in your house. So notice all those things that he's saying about David. He's loyal to you. He's your family member. You've picked him to lead your people, and he's got glory in your house. So what's the problem if today I've inquired for him? But we don't know if he did inquire of him. And of course, there's the wonderful play on words that inquired is lasha'al. So I have solved for him. And the emphasis here is a very strong phrase in Hebrew, by no means. Now, Lee here used 21 times in the Masoretic text, and we've seen it a few times earlier, highlighting by no means or absolutely not. And so he's highlighting, of course, I'm a priest. That's what I do. I inquire of God for people who are serving Yahweh. And aren't you, Saul, serving Yahweh? After all, it's Yahweh who made you king. And that's the argument he's making here. And he continues one more line. Do not let the king impute, or literally put a word to his slave, or to any member of my father's house. For your servant has known nothing of all of this, much or little. So they're at least trying to protect the rest of the priests who clearly have nothing to do with any of this. But the phrase he ends with, much or little, echoes chapter 20, verse 2. Let's go back to that just for a moment so we can hear the parallel. This is Jonathan speaking here about to David. He said to David, far from it, using the same phrase, you shall not die. My father does nothing either great or small without disclosing it to me, precisely what Saul is complaining that his slaves are not doing to him. Why should my father hide this from me? Never. And so we see that phrase, a great or small, paralleling the much or little here. And as Polza notes below, in Jonathan's formulation, knowledge of things great and small goes with life. In Ahimelech's case, ignorance of matters great or small will lead to death. And so the king responds. Notice he doesn't respond to any of the particular charges. He doesn't argue about what he says about David. And he doesn't make a point of saying, you confessed inquiring, that's what I'm going to have you killed for. He simply says, you shall surely die, using the verb in the doubled form for emphasis in Hebrew, you shall die, yes, die. And finally, using his name here, Ahimelech, which he had not done before, you and all your father's house. And as Falkelman notes here, I think very insightfully, Saul sees disjunction where there is none, that is, between himself and his servants and between himself and Ahimelech, and applies conjunction, which is to say, Ahimelech and his father's house, where it does not belong, because all those in the father's house, as far as we know, have not met with David at all. And so why is Ahimelech giving this testimony and certainly knowing that this would be the outcome? And I'd like to suggest, and I'll provide more evidence in the next scene when we see the execution scene, that like so many before him, and we'll look at some of those next time before him, he's willing to take the stand on behalf of God and willing to die for the cause rather than to fight back or to run. So David is running because he understands that his time to be king is important and that he's waiting for that. But the priest here is willing to confess and take a stand and take his chances. And we'll see the consequences of that next time when Doeg will be called upon to be the executioner of Ahimelech and his entire house of priests. See you next time. Bye-bye.